Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest consequences. There are moments when helping a stranger changes everything you thought you knew about your place in the world. Elias Thorne lives alone in the mountains with only his half-wolf companion Shade. When he hears a cart crash in the valley below, he rushes to help. The injured old man seems ordinary enough, grateful but proud, hurt but tough. Elias nurses him back to health for 3 days, never asking his name. He fixes the broken cart and guides the stranger safely down the mountain. But this wasn't just any traveler. The old man owns every acre of land Elias has ever called home. Every tree, every stream, every hunting trail belongs to this stranger he just saved. What happens when an act of simple human decency puts a man face to face with the owner of his entire world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the peaks above Widow's Notch in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the valley floor where Elias Thorne had made his home for the better part of 15 years. His cabin sat nestled against a stand of ancient pines, their massive trunks scarred by decades of mountain storms, but still standing proud against the sky. The structure itself was modest, logs chinked tight against the weather, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun and afternoon shade in equal measure. Elias stepped onto his covered porch, boots settling into wood worn smooth by countless mornings, just like this one. In his weathered hands, he carried his grandfather's Winchester, the metal cold to the touch but warming quickly in the mountain air. The rifle had been passed down through 3 generations of Thorne men, each adding their own small marks to its character: a nick in the stock from his grandfather's encounter with a wounded bear, a careful repair his father had made to the trigger guard, and now the gentle patina that came from Elias's own careful maintenance over the years. Shade emerged from beneath the porch where he'd spent the night, yellow eyes alert and intelligent as they surveyed the familiar territory. The animal was larger than most wolves, with the broader chest and stronger jaw that spoke to his mixed heritage. His coat carried the silver grey of his wild ancestors, marked with darker patches along his ears and muzzle that gave him an almost regal bearing. Elias had found him as a pup, abandoned after hunters had killed his pack mother, and the bond that had formed between them ran deeper than simple companionship. "Morning, old friend," Elias murmured, running his fingers through the thick fur at Shade's neck. The wolf dog leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating through his chest. The mountain air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, tinged with the scent of pine resin and the distant promise of snow that would come with the turning seasons. Elias breathed deeply, letting the familiar smells and sounds wash over him. This was his sanctuary, his refuge from a world that had grown too complex and demanding for his tastes. Up here, life moved at the pace of the seasons, measured in the migration of elk herds and the changing colors of aspen leaves rather than the frantic rush of civilization below. He'd chosen this solitude deliberately, though the path that led him here had been carved by loss as much as desire. His parents had died in a flash flood when he was 25, their small ranch in the valley claimed by waters that had risen too fast and too high for anyone to escape. Elias had sold what remained, taken his inheritance and his grandfather's teachings, and climbed into the high country where the world felt manageable again. The morning routine began, as it always did, with a careful inspection of the snares he'd set along the game trails that crisscrossed the mountainside. Shade ranged ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally pausing to investigate a scent that caught his attention. They moved through the forest with the easy rhythm of long practice, each knowing the other's habits and preferences without need for words. The first snare held a fat rabbit, its neck broken cleanly in the wire loop. Elias reset the trap with practiced efficiency, adding the rabbit to his game bag. The second and third snares were empty, but the fourth had captured a grouse that would make for fine eating when properly prepared. As they worked their way through the morning check, Elias found his thoughts drifting to memories of his grandfather, who had first brought him to these mountains as a boy. Old Henrik Thorne had been a man of few words but deep wisdom, a Norwegian immigrant who'd carved out a living in the wilderness through sheer determination and an understanding of the land that bordered on the mystical. He'd taught Elias to read the signs that nature provided, the way animals moved before a storm, the subtle changes in wind direction that signaled shifting weather, the art of moving silently through forest that seemed to have eyes and ears in every shadow. "The land don't belong to us, boy," Henrik had said during one of their hunting trips, his accent still thick despite decades in America. "We belong to the land. You remember that and it'll take care of you. Forget it, and you'll find yourself lost no matter where you stand." The Winchester had been Henrik's constant companion, and now it was Elias's. The rifle had fed 3 generations of Thorne men, had protected them from the dangers that came with mountain life, and had served as a symbol of the values that bound them together: self-reliance, respect for the natural world, and the understanding that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by how he conducted himself when no one was watching. By mid-morning, Elias and Shade had completed their circuit of the snares and were heading toward the small stream that provided fresh water for the cabin. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and Elias knelt beside it to fill his water jugs. Shade lapped at the current, his reflection wavering in the moving water. The sound of the stream masked other noises in the forest, but Shade's ears were sharper than human hearing, and his head lifted suddenly, turning toward the valley below. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not aggressive but alert, warning of something unusual in their territory. Elias straightened slowly. Winchester held ready, but not threatening. In all his years on the mountain, he'd learned to trust Shade's instincts. The wolf dog rarely gave false alarms, and when he sensed something amiss, it was worth investigating. They moved carefully through the trees, staying to the shadows and high ground that gave them advantage over whatever might be moving in the valley below. As they drew closer to the edge of their usual range, Elias could make out the faint sound of human voices, carried on the wind that moved up from the lower elevations. It wasn't unusual for travelers to pass through the area, though most stuck to the established trails that led over the mountain passes. Trappers, prospectors, and the occasional hunting party made their way through Widow's Notch during the warmer months, following routes that had been used by mountain men and Native Americans for generations before them. But something about these voices felt different, more urgent than the casual conversation of travelers making their way along familiar paths. Elias positioned himself behind a cluster of boulders that offered cover while still providing a clear view of the valley floor. Shade settling beside him with the patient alertness of a born hunter. What he saw below made him frown with concern. A small party of men had stopped beside the creek that ran through the bottom of the valley, their horses standing with the dejected posture of animals that had been pushed hard. One of the men was examining something on the ground, while the others stood in a loose circle around him, their body language suggesting tension and disagreement. Even at this distance, Elias could see that these weren't casual travelers. Their clothing was too fine, their equipment too expensive, and their horses bore the kind of breeding that spoke to significant wealth. More troubling was the way they moved, constantly scanning their surroundings as if they expected trouble or were perhaps the source of it themselves. Shade's growl had faded to a low rumble, but his hackles remained raised, and his yellow eyes never left the group below. The wolf dog's instincts had saved Elias from more than one dangerous situation over the years, and he'd learned to pay attention when his companion showed signs of unease. The men below seemed to reach some kind of decision, remounting their horses and continuing up the valley toward the pass. But instead of following the established trail, they were heading directly toward the area where Elias had set his snares, moving in a direction that would bring them uncomfortably close to his cabin. As he watched them disappear into the trees, Elias felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The solitude he'd worked so hard to maintain was precious to him, not just for the peace it provided, but for the protection it offered from complications he'd left behind in the world below. Visitors meant questions, and questions led to entanglements that could threaten everything he'd built in these mountains. He remained in position for several more minutes, making sure the riders had truly moved on before starting back toward his cabin. The morning's hunting had been successful, but the encounter with the strangers had left him unsettled in a way that he couldn't quite define. As they walked home through the forest, Shade ranging ahead to scout for any signs of the riders' passage, Elias found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this place. He'd never regretted his decision to leave the valley, never looked back with longing at the life he'd abandoned. But moments like this reminded him that even in the most remote wilderness, a man couldn't entirely escape the reach of the world beyond. The cabin came into view through the trees, its familiar outline bringing a sense of comfort and security that helped settle his nerves. This was home, sanctuary, the place where he could be himself without pretense or explanation. Whatever those riders were doing in his territory, whatever business had brought them into the high country, it wasn't his concern as long as they stayed clear of his land and respected his privacy. But as he climbed the steps to his porch and settled the Winchester into its accustomed place beside the door, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming, whether he wanted it or not. Shade seemed to sense his mood, pressing close against his leg with the warm weight of faithful companionship. The mountain had been his refuge for 15 years, and in all that time he'd managed to avoid the complications that came with other people's problems. But standing there in the morning light, watching the peaks that had sheltered him for so long, Elias felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling that his solitary world was about to become much more complicated. The crash came 3 days later, shattering the mountain's silence like a gunshot in a cathedral. Elias was splitting firewood behind his cabin when the sound reached him, the sharp crack of splintering wood followed by the terrified screaming of horses and a man's voice raised in alarm. The noise echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing between the peaks until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. He dropped his axe and grabbed the Winchester from where it leaned against the cabin wall. Shade was already moving, his powerful legs carrying him toward the source of the disturbance with the fluid grace of his wild ancestors. Together they plunged down the mountainside, following the steep game trail that led toward Widow's Notch. The wreckage lay scattered across a narrow section of the old mining road, where the path curved sharply around a massive boulder that had fallen from the cliffs above, sometime in the distant past. A heavy freight wagon had tried to navigate the turn too quickly, its right wheel striking the boulder with enough force to shatter the wooden spokes and send the entire conveyance careening off the roadway. The wagon lay on its side 20 feet below the road, its contents spilled across the rocky ground. Sacks of flour and beans had burst open, their contents mixing with the mountain soil. A trunk had broken apart, scattering clothing and personal effects among the debris. One of the horses was down, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle, while its partner stood trembling nearby, still trapped in the traces and bleeding from cuts across its flanks. But it was the man trapped beneath the wagon's edge that commanded Elias's immediate attention. He was older than Elias, had expected from the strength of the voice he'd heard crying out, perhaps 70 years, with silver hair and a face weathered by decades of mountain weather. His left leg was pinned beneath the wagon's heavy wooden frame, and blood seeped from a gash along his temple where his head had struck the rocks during the crash. "Easy there," Elias called out as he approached, hands visible and movements slow. "I'm here to help." The old man's eyes were sharp and alert despite his injury, taking in Elias's appearance with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to judging character in dangerous situations. "Wheel gave way on the turn," he said through gritted teeth. "Damn fool thing to happen." Elias knelt beside the wagon, examining the situation with practiced eye. The conveyance wasn't impossibly heavy, but it would take careful maneuvering to lift it without causing further injury to the trapped man. "What's your name, friend?" "Name's not important right now," the old man replied, his voice tight with pain. "What matters is getting me out from under this contraption before I lose the use of this leg entirely." There was something in the man's tone that suggested he was accustomed to being in control of situations, even when trapped beneath an overturned wagon in the middle of nowhere. Elias filed that observation away for later consideration and focused on the immediate problem. "Shade, back off," he commanded, and the wolf dog retreated to a safe distance. Using a fallen log as a lever and a flat rock as a fulcrum, Elias positioned himself to lift the wagon's weight off the injured man's leg. "When I lift, you pull yourself clear. Don't try to be gentle about it, just get free." The effort required every ounce of strength Elias possessed, muscles straining against the wagon's weight while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. For a moment, the heavy frame resisted his efforts, but then it shifted upward just enough to allow the old man to drag himself clear. He collapsed beside the overturned wagon, breathing heavily and clutching his injured leg. The limb was badly bruised and possibly fractured, but at least it was still attached and properly aligned. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp cuts always bled heavily, but this one didn't appear to have caused serious damage. "You'll live," Elias said, examining the injuries with the rough competence of someone who dealt with wilderness accidents before. Legs not broken, just badly bruised. Head wounds messy but not deep. The old man studied him with eyes that seemed to take in far more than simple appearance. "You have medical training?" "Mountain training," Elias replied. "Man learns to patch himself up out here, or he doesn't last long." He turned his attention to the horses, moving slowly to avoid spooking them further. The injured animal would need to be put down. Its leg was clearly broken and would never heal properly in these conditions. The other horse was cut but not seriously injured. "I can't walk on this leg," the old man said, struggling to sit upright against a boulder. "Can't drive the wagon even if we could ride it, which we can't, with that wheel destroyed." Elias was already considering options. The nearest settlement was Greer's Crossing, a hard day's walk down the mountain even for someone in good health. Carrying an injured man, that distance was out of the question, and leaving him here while going for help presented its own dangers. "There's another way," he said finally. "My cabin's not far from here. You can recover there while I figure out how to get you down to the valley." The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You live up here?" 15 years now." Elias began gathering the scattered supplies that could be salvaged from the wreck. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Better than spending the night in the open with that leg. I don't want to impose, no imposition." Elias's tone carried the finality of a decision made. "Mountain code says you don't leave an injured man to fend for himself. Besides, I've got plenty of room." It took the better part of 2 hours to get the old man up to the cabin. Elias fashioned a crude stretcher from the wagon's undamaged canvas and some straight branches, then used Shade's help to navigate the steep terrain. The wolf dog seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation, ranging ahead to find the easiest path, and even helping to steady the stretcher when the going got particularly rough. By the time they reached the cabin, both men were exhausted, and the old man's face had taken on the grey pallor that spoke of pain, held in check through sheer willpower. Elias helped him inside and settled him on the bed that occupied one corner of the cabin's single room. "Been a while since I've had company," Elias said as he built up the fire and set water to boil for cleaning the wounds. "Hope you don't mind simple fare." The old man was looking around the cabin with obvious interest, taking in the sparse but well-maintained furnishings, the neat arrangement of tools and supplies, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "This is your home. Has been for longer than I care to remember." Elias brought over a basin of warm water and clean cloth. "Now hold still while I tend to that head wound." As he cleaned the blood away and examined the injury more closely, Elias found himself studying his unexpected guest. The man's clothes were well made but practical. Wool pants, leather boots that had seen hard use, a cotton shirt that spoke of quality without ostentation. His hands were weathered and calloused, suggesting someone who wasn't afraid of physical work despite his obvious age. But there was something else. Something in the way he held himself even while injured that suggested authority, command, the habit of being obeyed. This wasn't a simple traveler or prospector passing through the mountains on business of his own. "What brought you up here?" Elias asked as he worked. "Not many take that road unless they have specific business in the high country." The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "Looking at land," he said finally. "Considering some investments in the area." It was a reasonable explanation, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. Elias filed that observation away, along with the others, and focused on bandaging the head wound. Whatever his guest's business might be, it could wait until the man was properly healed. "You'll need to stay off that leg for a few days," he said, settling back on his heels. "Give the swelling time to go down and make sure there's no serious damage." "I appreciate your help," the old man said, and for the first time since the accident, his voice carried genuine warmth. "More than you know." Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the higher peaks. Winter was still weeks away, but the mountains had their own schedule, and Elias could feel the change in the air. Whatever had brought this stranger to his doorstep, they would have time to sort it out properly. As he prepared a simple supper of venison and beans, Elias found himself wondering about the man resting in his bed. In 15 years of mountain solitude, he'd never brought an injured stranger home, never opened his sanctuary to anyone from the world below. But looking at the old man's weathered face in the firelight, he felt no regret about his decision. The mountain code was clear about helping those in need, and some things were more important than privacy. He just hoped he wouldn't come to regret that choice. The stranger slept fitfully through the first night, his breathing heavy but steady as the mountain cold settled around the cabin. Elias kept the fire burning bright, adding split logs whenever the flames began to dim. He'd made his bed on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in thick blankets that smelled of wood smoke and pine sap. But sleep came in fragments between his guests' occasional groans and the settling sounds of the old logs that formed his home's walls. By morning, the man's color had improved, though he still favored his injured leg when Elias helped him sit up to examine the wounds. The head gash was already beginning to heal, sealed beneath the clean bandages, and the swelling in his leg had gone down enough to reveal that no bones were broken. "You'll mend," Elias said, rewrapping the bandages with practiced efficiency. "Mountain air has a way of speeding things along." "I'm grateful for your care," the old man replied, accepting a cup of coffee brewed strong and black. "And for your hospitality. Been a long time since I've experienced such simple kindness." There was something melancholy in his tone that made Elias look up from his own cup. "Sounds like you don't encounter much kindness in your regular dealings." "Business tends to complicate relationships," the stranger said carefully. "When money's involved, people's motivations become harder to read." Elias nodded, understanding more than his guest might have expected. He'd seen enough of the world below to know how wealth could poison even the most straightforward interactions. "That's part of why I prefer the mountains. Up here, things are more honest. A man's word means something, and you can generally tell friend from foe by their actions rather than their promises." "You speak like someone who's had experience with both kinds of people." "Some," Elias admitted. "Enough to know I prefer the company of trees and wildlife to most humans." The old man chuckled, a sound that carried genuine amusement despite his physical discomfort. "Yet here you are, caring for a complete stranger who could be anyone or anything." "Mountain code," Elias said simply. "You don't leave a man to die if you can help him live. Everything else is details." They spent the morning in easy conversation, the kind of talk that flows naturally between men who've both known hardship and solitude. The stranger, who still hadn't offered his name despite Elias's gentle prompts, proved to be well educated and widely traveled. He spoke knowledgeably about everything from mining techniques to timber management, always with the practical understanding that came from hands-on experience rather than book learning. Around midday, Elias decided to check his snares and hunt for fresh meat to supplement their meals. The stranger was stable enough to be left alone for a few hours, and Shade would remain at the cabin to alert them if anything went wrong. "I'll be back before dark," Elias said, shouldering his rifle and game bag. "Shade here will keep you company. He's good at sensing trouble before it arrives." The wolf dog settled beside the bed with the alert patience of a born guardian, yellow eyes fixed on the stranger with calm assessment. The old man reached out tentatively to scratch behind Shade's ears, and the animal accepted the attention with dignified tolerance. "Unusual companion," the stranger observed. "Found him as a pup after hunters killed his pack," Elias replied. "Seemed wrong to leave him to starve when I could raise him proper. He's been good company ever since. The hunting was productive. Elias's snares had caught 2 rabbits and a fat grouse, while an hour of patient stalking through the pine groves yielded a young deer that would provide meat for several days. As he field-dressed the animals and prepared them for transport back to the cabin, he found his thoughts returning to his unexpected guest. The man was clearly more than he appeared. His clothes, while practical, were made from expensive materials. His hands showed calluses, but they were the kind that came from handling reins and tools rather than the deep scarring that marked a lifetime of hard labor. Most telling of all was his manner of speaking, educated, measured, with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But none of that changed the fundamental situation. The man was injured, far from help, and dependent on Elias's assistance to survive. Whatever secrets he might be carrying could wait until he was strong enough to travel. The afternoon light was fading by the time Elias returned to the cabin, his game bag heavy with the day's success. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air, and warm lamplight glowed through the windows. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that he hadn't experienced since his parents' death, and he was surprised to find it comforting rather than intrusive. Inside, he found his guest sitting up in bed, examining something he quickly concealed when Elias entered. Whatever it was disappeared beneath the blankets with a smoothness that spoke of long practice at hiding things from view. "Good hunting?" the stranger asked, his tone perhaps a bit too casual. "Good enough." Elias began unpacking his game bag, laying out the rabbits and grouse on the cabin's small preparation table. "Fresh meat will do us both good after days of preserved food." As he worked to clean and prepare the game, Elias was aware of his guest, watching every movement with sharp attention. The old man asked occasional questions about hunting techniques and meat preservation, displaying the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested more than casual interest in wilderness survival. "You know your way around wild game," Elias observed as he sectioned one of the rabbits for cooking. "A man learns many things over the course of a long life," the stranger replied. "Some skills prove more useful than others. What kind of business keeps you traveling through country like this?" Elias asked, hoping for a more direct answer than he'd received to previous questions. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "Land business," he said finally. "I own property in various places. Sometimes a man needs to see his holdings with his own eyes, rather than rely on reports from others." It was the most specific information the stranger had volunteered about himself, but it raised more questions than it answered. What kind of property required personal inspection in the remote mountain passes? And why travel alone, rather than with the kind of security that valuable landholdings would normally warrant? But Elias kept his curiosity to himself as he prepared their evening meal. The rabbit stewed slowly over the fire, seasoned with wild herbs he'd gathered during his hunting expedition. The simple fare filled the cabin with rich aromas that made both men's stomachs growl in anticipation. They ate in companionable silence as darkness settled over the mountains outside. The stranger complimented the cooking with genuine appreciation, and Elias found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. It had been years since he'd shared a meal with another human being, and he'd forgotten how pleasant it could be to have conversation with someone who understood the rhythms of mountain life. After dinner, as they sat by the fire sharing the last of Elias's carefully hoarded coffee, the old man finally asked the question that had been hanging between them all day. "What brought you up here, Elias?" "A man doesn't choose this kind of isolation without good reason." Elias considered how much to reveal, then decided that honesty deserved honesty in return. "Lost my parents when I was young. Flash flood took their ranch, and everything I'd ever known. Seemed like the mountains were the only place left where a man could live on his own terms. No regrets." "Some days," Elias admitted, "but not many. The mountains don't lie to you or promise things they can't deliver. They're hard but fair, and that's more than I can say for most of the world below." The stranger nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "Fair is a rare quality in any business dealings. Perhaps that's why I find your company so refreshing." Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the promise of weather changes to come. But inside the cabin, warmth and friendship held the darkness at bay, and both men slept more peacefully than either had in many months. The second morning brought with it a crystalline clarity that only comes after mountain storms have scrubbed the air clean. Elias woke to find his guest already awake, sitting propped against the cabin wall and staring out the window at the snow-dusted peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the pale sky. "Beautiful country," the old man said without turning from the view. "A man could understand why someone would want to make a life here. It has its compensations," Elias agreed, building up the fire from the banked coals. "Coffee? Please." The stranger shifted carefully, testing his injured leg. "I think I might be able to walk a bit today. This lying around doesn't suit me." Elias handed him a steaming cup and settled into the cabin's single chair, a sturdy piece he'd built himself from lodgepole pine. "Take your time. That leg needs proper healing, and there's no rush to get anywhere." But even as he spoke the words, Elias could see restlessness building in his guest's eyes. This was a man accustomed to action, to controlling his environment rather than being controlled by it. The forced inactivity was clearly wearing on him, injury or no injury. "Tell me about this land," the stranger said, gesturing toward the window. How far does it extend?" "Who owns what up here?" "Most of it belongs to someone down in the valley," Elias replied carefully. "Fellow named Greer, from what I understand." "I've never met him, but his name's on the survey markers when you can find them." Something flickered across the old man's face. Surprise, recognition, or perhaps amusement. It was gone so quickly that Elias might have imagined it, but he filed the observation away with the growing collection of puzzles surrounding his guest. "And you? Do you own this land or just live on it?" "I have a claim," Elias said, which was true enough. He'd filed the paperwork years ago, though he'd never been entirely certain whether it would hold up to legal scrutiny if challenged. "Homestead rights properly documented. Been here long enough to establish residence?" "Homestead law can be complicated in the territories," the stranger observed, "especially when larger landholders have prior claims or competing interests." The comment carried an undertone that made Elias look up sharply. "You sound like you know something about land law." "A man picks up knowledge over the years." The old man's tone was carefully neutral. "I've seen what happens when small holders come up against established interests. It's not always pleasant." There was something ominous in those words, a suggestion of threats that Elias couldn't quite grasp. "Are you saying I might have problems with this Greer fellow?" "I'm saying that powerful men often have different ideas about land use than the people actually living on the land." The stranger met his eyes directly. "Sometimes those differences lead to conflict." Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "You're not here by accident, are you?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications that neither man seemed ready to address directly. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. "Accidents are rare in my line of work," he said finally. But circumstances sometimes arrange themselves in unexpected ways. It wasn't exactly an answer, but it confirmed what Elias had begun to suspect. His guest was connected to the land disputes he'd mentioned, possibly even representing the mysterious Greer, whose name appeared on survey stakes throughout the mountain valleys. "What kind of work do you do?" Elias asked, though he was beginning to suspect he might not like the answer. "I solve problems," the stranger replied. "Usually problems involving land, money, and people who can't seem to reach reasonable agreements on their own." The chill in Elias's stomach deepened. Men who solved problems involving land and money were rarely good news. For people like him, small holders trying to live quietly on claims that might not stand, up to legal challenges from well-funded opponents. "And you're here to solve problems involving my land?" "I'm here because my wagon crashed and you saved my life," the old man said firmly. "Whatever other business I might have had in these mountains has been temporarily set aside." It was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Elias found himself studying his guest with new eyes, seeing past the injured traveler to the calculating intelligence that lay beneath. This was a man accustomed to power, to getting his way through means both subtle and direct. But he was also a man who'd accepted help gracefully, who'd shown genuine appreciation for simple kindness, and who'd spent 2 days engaged in honest conversation without once trying to intimidate or manipulate his host. Whatever his business might be, he conducted himself with a code of honor that Elias could respect. "Well," Elias said finally, "whatever problems you're here to solve will have to wait until you can walk properly. Mountain hospitality doesn't end just because a man's business might conflict with mine." The stranger smiled for the first time since the accident, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed glimpses of the younger man he'd once been. "You're either very wise or very foolish, Elias Thorne." "Probably both," Elias admitted. "But I've never been one to abandon a principle just because it might prove inconvenient." They spent the rest of the morning in carefully neutral conversation, both men now aware of the undercurrents that flowed beneath their surface friendship. The old man proved to be well-read and widely traveled, with stories from places Elias had only heard about in newspapers. But beneath every anecdote lay the suggestion of wealth, influence, and the kind of power that could reshape entire regions according to one man's vision. Around midday, Elias helped his guest take his first tentative steps around the cabin. The injured leg was still weak and painful, but it would bear weight without giving way entirely. Progress, though not yet enough to attempt the difficult journey down to the valley settlements. Another day or two, Elias judged, watching the careful way the old man moved. "Then we can think about getting you back to wherever you need to be. And what happens then?" the stranger asked, settling back onto the bed with obvious relief. "Then you go back to solving your problems, and I go back to living quietly in the mountains." Elias met his eyes steadily. "Assuming that's still possible." "There are always options," the old man said. "The trick is recognizing which ones serve everyone's interests, rather than just one party's immediate desires." It sounded like the beginning of a negotiation, though Elias wasn't entirely sure what was being negotiated. His land rights? His future in the mountains? Or something else entirely? Outside, Shade's warning bark cut through their conversation, sharp and urgent in the mountain air. Both men turned toward the sound, and Elias was already reaching for his rifle when the wolf dog's alarm escalated to a full howl of challenge. Someone was coming up the mountain, and from Shade's reaction, they weren't bringing friendly intentions. Elias moved to the window with practiced stealth, Winchester in hand, while his guest struggled to sit up straighter despite his injured leg. Shade's howling had settled into a steady growl that meant the approaching visitors were still at a distance but getting closer. "Friends of yours?" Elias asked quietly, though the tension in the air suggested he already knew the answer. "Possibly," the old man replied, his voice carrying a weight of resignation. "I've been missing for 3 days. Eventually, someone was bound to come looking." Through the window, Elias could make out movement in the trees below, several riders picking their way carefully up the mountain trail. They moved with the coordinated precision of men who knew their business, and their business appeared to involve finding people who didn't want to be found. "How many people knew you were coming up here?" "Enough." The stranger was reaching beneath his pillow for something, and when his hand emerged, it held a leather portfolio bound with brass fittings. "Elias, there are things I need to tell you before they arrive." "Such as?" The old man opened the portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. Even from across the room, Elias could see the elaborate seals and signatures that marked legal papers of significant importance. "My name is Silas Greer," the stranger said simply, "and I own this mountain." The words hit Elias like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him staring at the man he'd nursed back to health for 3 days, the man whose life he'd saved, the man who owned every acre of land Elias had called home for 15 years. "You're—" Elias began, then stopped, his mind reeling with the implications. "I'm the man you've been wondering about," Silas confirmed. "The one whose name is on those survey markers you mentioned. The one who, according to territorial law, holds title to everything from Widow's Notch to the valley floor." Elias felt the world shifting beneath his feet, like loose shale on a steep slope. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, every assumption he'd made about his place in these mountains was suddenly in question. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to understand what kind of man you were," Silas replied. "When someone saves your life, you learn things about their character that social conventions tend to hide. I needed to know who Elias Thorne really was before I decided what to do about his homestead claim." The riders were closer now, there, voices carrying up the mountainside as they called to each other. Shade's growling had taken on an even more menacing tone, and Elias could see the wolf dog positioning himself between the cabin and the approaching visitors. "And what have you decided?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents in his hands as if they held answers to questions he hadn't yet figured out how to ask. "That's more complicated than it was 3 days ago." "Why?" "Because 3 days ago, you were just a name on a disputed land claim. A squatter who'd built a cabin on property he didn't own and needed to be relocated for the good of my larger development plans." Silas looked up from the papers, meeting Elias's eyes directly. "Now you're the man who saved my life." The sound of horses drew closer, accompanied by men's voices raised in urgent conversation. Elias could make out at least 4 riders, possibly more, and their tone suggested they were armed and prepared for trouble. "What kind of development plans?" Elias asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Mining interests," Silas replied. "There's copper in these mountains, probably silver as well, the kind of mineral wealth that could support a significant operation if properly developed. And my cabin sits right in the middle of where you want to dig. Among other considerations, yes." Silas folded the documents carefully and returned them to the portfolio. "But that was before I understood what kind of man lived in that cabin." The first rider emerged from the trees below, a hard-faced man in expensive trail clothes who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. Behind him came 3 others, all armed, all scanning the mountainside with the alertness of professional security. "Mr. Greer," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Are you all right, sir?" Silas moved carefully to the window, favoring his injured leg, but managing to stand without assistance. "I'm here, Matthias, injured but alive." The relief in the rider's voice was evident even at this distance. "We've been searching for 3 days, sir. When we found the wreckage of your wagon—" "I had help," Silas called back. "Give me a few minutes to gather my things, then we'll head down together." He turned back to Elias, who was still struggling to process everything he'd learned in the past few minutes. "Those men work for me. They're good at their jobs, but they're not known for their patience with people who complicate my business interests. And I complicate your business interests considerably. Silas's smile held no malice, but it carried the weight of hard decisions made by men who controlled vast resources. The question is what we do about that complication. Elias set down his rifle and faced the man who held his future in weathered hands. What are my options? You could accept a generous settlement for your improvements to the land and relocate somewhere else. I'd be fair about compensation, more than fair considering the circumstances. And if I choose not to relocate, then you'd be fighting a legal battle against resources you can't match, over land claims that might not survive scrutiny in territorial court. Silas's tone was matter-of-fact rather than threatening. It wouldn't end well for you. The riders had reached the base of the trail that led up to the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. Soon they'd be close enough to overhear any conversation, and Elias sensed that whatever decision was going to be made needed to happen quickly. There's a third option, Silas said quietly, but it would require trust on both sides. What kind of option? The kind that recognizes what I've learned about your character over the past 3 days. The kind that acknowledges that some things are more valuable than mineral rights or development opportunities. Before Elias could ask what he meant, the sound of boots on the cabin's wooden steps announced that their private conversation was about to become very public. Whatever Silas Greer had in mind, it would have to wait until they could speak, without his employees listening to every word. But as the door opened to admit the first of the armed men, Elias caught something in the older man's eyes that looked almost like hope, as if the man who owned the mountain had found something worth more than all the copper and silver buried beneath it. Something that might just change everything. Matthias entered the cabin with the cautious efficiency of a man who'd spent years anticipating trouble. He was perhaps 40 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of scars that spoke of violent encounters survived rather than avoided. His eyes swept the single room, cataloguing potential threats before settling on Elias with obvious suspicion. "This the man who helped you, Mr. Greer?" he asked, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered pistol. "This is Elias Thorne," Silas confirmed. "He saved my life after the wagon accident. I owe him a considerable debt." The other 3 men had positioned themselves around the cabin's exterior, and through the windows, Elias could see them maintaining a loose perimeter that would prevent anyone from approaching undetected. These weren't simple ranch hands or mining workers. They moved with the disciplined coordination of former military men who'd found profitable employment in private security. "We were worried when we found the wreckage," Matthias said, his attention divided between Silas and Elias. "Looked like the horses had been spooked by something. Maybe mountain cats or wolves. The wheel gave way on the turn," Silas explained. "Poor engineering on my part, trying to take that curve too quickly with a heavy load." Matthias nodded, but his eyes continued to study Elias with the calculating assessment of someone who solved problems by eliminating complications. "We should get you back to town, sir. Dr. Hayes will want to examine those injuries properly in a moment." Silas moved carefully to where his scattered belongings had been gathered from the wagon wreckage. "Mr. Thorne and I have some business to discuss first. Sir, with respect, any business dealings should probably wait until you've recovered from your injuries, and perhaps be conducted in more appropriate surroundings." There was a subtle emphasis on the word appropriate that made Elias's jaw tighten. He'd been dismissed by men like Matthias before, judged by his rough clothes and simple cabin rather than his character or accomplishments. "The surroundings are exactly appropriate for the business at hand," Silas said firmly, his tone carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his decisions respected. "Mr. Thorne, would you be willing to accompany us down to the valley? I believe we have matters to discuss that require more time than we have available here." Elias glanced at Shade, who was still positioned near the door with his hackles raised. The wolf-dog's instincts were telling him that these newcomers represented a threat, and 15 years of partnership had taught Elias to trust those instincts. "What kind of matters?" The kind that could benefit both of us, Silas replied carefully. But they're not the sort of thing that should be discussed in front of an audience. Matthias stepped forward slightly, his movement casual, but clearly intended to remind everyone in the room that he was armed and prepared to use that advantage if necessary. Mr. Greer, I don't think it's wise to— What you think is noted and disregarded, Silas cut him off with the sharp edge of command authority. Mr. Thorne is my guest, not my prisoner. Any discussions we have will be conducted as equals. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias found himself in the uncomfortable position of being caught between two men who were obviously accustomed to getting their way, but who had very different ideas about how this situation should be resolved. I appreciate the invitation, Elias said finally, but I think we both know that leaving this mountain would put me at a significant disadvantage in any business negotiations. Silas's smile was approving rather than surprised. A fair point. Then perhaps we should arrange for privacy here. He turned to Matthias with the kind of look that had probably ended more than one subordinate's career. Take the men and establish a camp at the clearing by the stream. We'll join you there in an hour. Sir, I don't recommend leaving you alone with the man who saved my life. Silas's eyebrows rose. The man who's had multiple opportunities to do me harm, if that was his intention. Your concern is noted, Matthias, but your services aren't required for this particular conversation. Matthias clearly didn't like the order, but he was too experienced a soldier to argue with direct commands from his employer. 1 hour, sir. If you're not down at the camp by then, we'll be coming back up. Understood. After the security men had departed, taking their aura of barely controlled violence with them, the cabin felt almost peaceful by comparison. Silas settled back onto the bed with obvious relief, while Elias moved to check that Shade was calm enough to be trusted around their earlier visitors. They don't much like the idea of you negotiating with a squatter, Elias observed. They're paid to be suspicious of everyone and protective of my interests, Silas replied. Unfortunately, they sometimes have difficulty distinguishing between legitimate threats and simple human complexity. And which am I? That's what I'm trying to determine. Silas pulled out a different set of documents from his portfolio, these ones bearing the official seals of the Territorial Mining Authority. Tell me, Elias, what do you know about mineral rights in this territory? Enough to know that whoever owns the surface usually controls what's underneath it. Usually, yes, but there are exceptions, particularly when it comes to claims filed under homestead law versus prior territorial grants. Silas spread the documents on the bed where Elias could see them. Your homestead claim covers approximately 160 acres. My territorial grant covers 12,000 acres, including your homestead plot. Elias studied the maps and legal descriptions, understanding enough to see that his position was even more precarious than he'd realized. So my claim is worthless? Not worthless, complicated. Silas traced a finger along one of the survey lines marked on the territorial map. Homestead law provides certain protections, particularly for individuals who've made significant improvements to the land and maintained continuous residence. A good lawyer might be able to argue that your claim has legal standing, despite the prior territorial grant. Might be able to argue isn't the same as would win in court. No, it's not. Silas folded the documents carefully. Which brings us to the proposition I mentioned earlier. Elias waited, sensing that whatever Silas was about to propose would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. I need someone I can trust to oversee the mining operations I'm planning for this region. Someone who knows the land, understands the people, and has the kind of character that inspires loyalty rather than fear. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership. Silas met his eyes directly. Your homestead claim, combined with my mineral rights, would create a joint venture that benefits both parties. You'd maintain ownership of your land while gaining a percentage of the mining profits. More importantly, you'd have a voice in how the development proceeds. It was not what Elias had expected to hear. Why would you offer that kind of partnership to someone you've known for 3 days? Because in 3 days, You've shown me more genuine character than most of my business associates have demonstrated in years." Silas's expression was serious, thoughtful. "And because I've learned that having the right partner is often more valuable than having all the profits." Outside, the sound of horses and men's voices reminded them both that their private conversation was taking place under the watchful eyes of armed guards who might not approve of the direction their negotiations were taking. The sound that interrupted their conversation wasn't the return of Matthias and his men. It was Shade's low, warning growl, followed by the distinctive whistle that Elias had taught him to use when spotting strangers approaching from the eastern trail. Someone else was coming up the mountain, someone who had nothing to do with Silas Greer's security detail. Elias moved to the window that faced east, Winchester in hand, while Silas struggled to organize his papers despite his injured leg. Through the trees, Elias could make out movement along the old prospector's trail that wound up from the valley below, two riders moving with the steady determination of men who knew exactly where they were. "Going? More of your people?" Elias asked. "No." Silas's voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there during their negotiations. "Matthias and his men are down at the stream to the west. These riders are coming from the direction of town." As the approaching horsemen drew closer, Elias could see that they wore the distinctive badges of territorial marshals, federal law enforcement operating under authority that superseded local jurisdictions and corporate interests alike. Their presence in these remote mountains suggested official business of significant importance. "Mr. Greer," Elias said quietly, "I think you may have bigger problems than mining claims to worry about." Silas joined him at the window, his face pale as he recognized the lead rider. "Marshal Davidson," he said, the name carrying the weight of old conflicts and unresolved disputes. "I was wondering when he'd turn up. You know him?" "We have history." Silas moved back to the bed, favoring his injured leg. "The kind of history that involves congressional investigations and federal grand juries." Before Elias could ask what that meant, the marshals had reached the cabin. The lead rider, a man perhaps 50 years, old with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades tracking fugitives across the western territories, dismounted with the careful precision of a professional lawman. "Mr. Greer," Marshal Davidson called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal warrant. "I need to speak with you." "About what matter, Marshal?" Silas replied through the closed door. "About irregularities in your territorial land grants. About mineral leases obtained through fraudulent surveys. About the deaths of 3 Paiute families whose traditional hunting grounds were destroyed by your mining operations." Elias felt the world shift again, this time in a direction that made his stomach clench with cold realization. The man he'd saved, the man who'd offered him partnership in a mining venture, was apparently wanted by federal authorities for crimes that included fraud and possibly murder. "Those are serious accusations," Silas said calmly. "Do you have warrants?" "I have a congressional subpoena requiring your testimony before a special committee investigating territorial land fraud. I also have authorization to seize any documents related to your mining claims pending a federal investigation." Marshal Davidson's companion had positioned himself to cover the cabin's rear exit, standard procedure for serving warrants on potentially dangerous subjects. These were men who dealt with desperate fugitives before and weren't taking any chances. "And if I choose not to cooperate with your investigation, then I arrest you for contempt of Congress and obstruction of a federal investigation. Either way, Mr. Greer, you're coming with me." Elias found himself in an impossible position. The man he'd saved was apparently a fugitive from federal justice, wanted for crimes that included the deaths of innocent families. But the same man had just offered him a partnership that could secure his future in these mountains, while providing him with influence over how development proceeded. "Elias," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "there are things about this situation that you don't understand, things that Davidson isn't telling you." "Such as?" such as the fact that those Paiute families died in a flash flood caused by a dam failure that had nothing to do with my mining operations, such as the fact that the surveys Davidson is calling fraudulent were conducted by territorial authorities using methods approved by the federal government. Marshal Davidson's voice cut through their conversation. Mr. Greer, I'm going to count to 10. Then I'm coming in whether you cooperate or not. The choice is yours, Silas said to Elias. You can hand me over to Davidson and wash your hands of this entire situation. Or you can help me reach my men down at the stream where I'll have enough protection to negotiate from a position of strength. Why would I help a man who's wanted for murder? Because I'm not a murderer. Silas's eyes were steady, holding none of the evasiveness Elias would have expected from a guilty man. Because the real story is more complicated than Davidson's accusations suggest. And because if you turn me over to him now, you'll never learn the truth about what's really happening in these mountains. 5. Davidson called out. Elias had seconds to make a decision that would define not just Silas's fate, but his own future. Everything he'd learned about the older man over the past 3 days suggested integrity, honor, and genuine concern for the welfare of others. But federal marshals didn't pursue innocent men across hundreds of miles of wilderness territory. 6. There's a back window, Elias said suddenly. Leads to a narrow ledge that connects to the old mine shaft about 50 yards east. If you can make it that far, there's a trail down to the stream that Matthias and his men should be able to defend. 7. Why are you helping me? Silas asked as he gathered his papers. Because you saved my life by offering me that partnership, Elias replied. And because a man who'd risk his own safety to help injured travelers doesn't strike me as the kind who'd murder innocent families. 8. They moved toward the rear of the cabin, Silas limping heavily but determined to reach safety before Davidson lost patience entirely. Shade seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, positioning himself between the cabin's front door and their escape route. 9. Elias helped Silas through the narrow window onto the ledge beyond, then grabbed his own rifle and game bag. Whatever was about to happen, he'd committed himself to seeing it through to the end. 10. The front door exploded inward as Marshal Davidson's boot connected with the wooden frame. But by then, Elias and Silas were already making their way across the dangerous ledge toward the old mine shaft, with Shade bringing up the rear and covering their retreat. Behind them, shouts of anger and commands to surrender echoed through the mountain air. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility that Elias had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But as they reached the mine shaft and began their descent toward the stream where Matthias waited, Silas turned to him with an expression of gratitude that seemed entirely genuine. "Thank you," he said simply. "Whatever happens next, I won't forget this. Just make sure you're worth the risk I'm taking," Elias replied. "I intend to prove exactly that," Silas said, starting with the truth about what's really been happening in these mountains. The sound of pursuit was growing louder behind them. But for the moment, they were ahead of their pursuers and moving toward whatever protection Silas's men could provide. As they made their way down the treacherous mountain trail, Elias reflected that 3 days ago his biggest concern had been checking his snares for rabbits. Now he was a fugitive from federal justice, having thrown his lot in with a man who might be either a victim of government persecution or a criminal fleeing the consequences of his crimes. Either way, there was no turning back now. The descent to the stream camp took longer than expected, slowed by Silas's injured leg and the need to avoid detection by Davidson's marshals, who were now searching the mountainside with systematic determination. Twice they had to take cover behind boulders as the sound of horses echoed through the canyon. And once Shade's low growl warned them of a marshal positioned along their intended route, forcing a dangerous detour across loose shale that could have sent them both tumbling into the ravine below. By the time they reached Matthias's camp, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the valley floor, and both men were exhausted from the strain of their escape. The security chief had positioned his men in a defensive perimeter around a grove of cottonwoods that provided both cover and multiple escape routes. The tactical thinking of someone who'd fought in campaigns where retreat was sometimes the only viable option. "Mr. Greer," Matthias said as they stumbled into the camp, his relief evident despite his professional composure. "We heard gunshots from the direction of your cabin. Are you injured?" "Not by gunfire," Silas replied, accepting a cup of water with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. "But we have problems. Federal marshals, led by Davidson." Matthias's expression darkened. "How many?" "Two that I saw, but there could be more. They're looking for me in connection with the congressional investigation. Then we need to get you out of the territory as quickly as possible." Matthias was already mentally calculating routes and resources. "If we ride hard, we can reach the Colorado border by tomorrow night." "No." Silas's tone carried the authority of final decision. "Running only makes me look guilty. It's time to face this situation directly. Sir, with respect, facing federal marshals directly usually ends with handcuffs and a long train ride to Washington. The committee isn't interested in hearing your side of the story. They've already decided you're guilty." Elias listened to their exchange with growing unease. These men were discussing flight from federal justice as if it were a routine business decision, weighing options and calculating risks with the casual efficiency of people who'd evaded legal authority before. "What's the real story?" he asked, interrupting their tactical discussion. "What actually happened to those Paiute families Davidson mentioned?" Silas and Matthias exchanged a look that carried years of shared knowledge and mutual trust. Finally, Silas nodded, and Matthias pulled out a leather case containing photographs and official documents. "3 families," Matthias said, spreading the materials where Elias could see them. 67 people total, including children. They died when the Antelope Creek Dam failed during spring runoff, drowning them in their traditional winter camp. The photographs were difficult to look at, bodies scattered along the creek bed, personal belongings caught in the debris of what had once been a substantial earthwork structure. But it was the official documents that told the real story. "The dam was built by the Territorial Development Authority," Silas explained. "Federal project designed to provide water storage for mining operations throughout the region. My company contracted to provide mineral extraction services, but we had nothing to do with the dam's construction or maintenance." "Then why are you being blamed for the deaths?" "Because someone needs to be held responsible," Matthias said bitterly. "And it's easier to blame a private contractor than admit that federal engineers built a defective dam that killed innocent people." Elias studied the engineering reports included in the documentation. Even with his limited technical knowledge, he could see that the dam had been constructed with inadequate foundations and substandard materials. Multiple inspection reports had noted potential problems, but no corrective action had been taken before the spring floods arrived. "The Congressional Committee is claiming that your mining operations weakened the dam structure," Elias said, reading from one of the federal documents. "They're claiming that because it shifts responsibility away from the government engineers who signed off on the original design." Silas replied, "Our mining operations were more than 5 miles downstream from the dam site. There's no way our activities could have affected its structural integrity. Then why don't you just testify before the committee and present this evidence?" Silas and Matthias exchanged another look. This one weighted with implications that Elias couldn't quite grasp, because the committee isn't interested in evidence that contradicts their predetermined conclusions. Matthias said finally, "Because several very powerful people in Washington have significant investments in competing mining companies that would benefit from Mr. Greer's operations being shut down. And because federal grand juries have a way of indicting people regardless of their actual guilt or innocence." The political complexities were beyond Elias's experience, but he understood enough to see that Silas was caught between government scapegoating and corporate competition. With his freedom and possibly his life hanging in the balance, "What's your plan?" he asked. "Present the truth to someone who has the authority to act on it," Silas said. "There's a territorial judge in Greer's Crossing, Judge Morrison, who's known for his integrity and independence. If we can get this evidence before him, he might be willing to issue injunctions that would prevent my arrest until the facts can be properly investigated. And if Judge Morrison isn't willing to get involved in a federal investigation, then we fight," Matthias said simply. "Mr. Greer isn't the only one with interests in these mountains. There are other mining companies, cattle ranchers, timber operations, all of them with reasons to prevent federal bureaucrats from seizing private property without due process." It was beginning to sound like the prelude to a range war, the kind of violent conflict that had torn apart other territories when competing interests couldn't resolve their differences through legal means. Elias had no desire to be caught in the middle of such a fight, but his decision to help Silas escape from Davidson had already committed him to one side of the conflict. "There's something else," Silas said, pulling out a final document from his portfolio. "Something that directly affects your situation, Elias." The paper was a formal legal contract, complete with official seals and notarized signatures. Even a quick reading made it clear that this was the partnership agreement Silas had offered earlier, drawn up in proper legal form and ready for signature. "I had this prepared before I left town," Silas explained. "The mining survey of your homestead area suggests significant copper deposits, possibly enough to support a major extraction operation. Your partnership share would be worth considerable money." "How considerable?" "Conservative estimates suggest somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 over the life of the mining operation, enough to make you independently wealthy for the rest of your life." The sum was almost beyond Elias's comprehension. In 15 years of mountain living, he'd never possessed more than a few $100s at one time. The kind of wealth Silas was offering would change everything about his existence, opening possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. "But there's a catch," he said, because in his experience, offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. "The catch is that if I'm arrested and convicted, the federal government will seize all my assets, including this partnership agreement. You'd lose everything along with me, and if you're cleared of the charges, then we proceed with the mining operation as planned, and you become one of the wealthiest men in the territory." It was a gamble with stakes higher than anything Elias had ever contemplated. Sign the partnership agreement and throw his lot in completely with Silas Greer, risking everything on the possibility that a man he'd known for 4 days was telling the truth about government conspiracy and corporate persecution, or walk away from the opportunity of a lifetime and return to his simple mountain existence. Knowing that he'd chosen safety over the chance for transformative wealth, the sound of horses approaching from the north interrupted his internal debate. Matthias and his men immediately took defensive positions, rifles ready, while Shade moved to Elias's side with hackles raised. "Riders coming in!" one of Matthias's men called out. "At least 6 moving fast." "Davidson?" Silas asked. "Unknown, but they're heading straight for our position." As the riders drew closer, Elias could make out enough detail to see that these weren't federal marshals. Their clothing and equipment suggested local law enforcement, possibly even civilian volunteers, recruited for a search party. "It's Sheriff Hawkins," Matthias said, lowering his rifle slightly. "From Greer's Crossing. Friend or foe?" Silas asked. "Depends on who's paying him this week." Matthias replied grimly. The approaching riders had spread out into a loose formation that could quickly become an attack pattern if negotiations went badly. These were men who knew their business, whether that business involved keeping the peace or enforcing someone else's version of justice. As Sheriff Hawkins rode into the camp with his 5 deputies, Elias realized that whatever decision he was going to make about the partnership agreement would have to be made quickly. The political complexities surrounding Silas Greer were about to become much more immediate and personal. "Mr. Greer," Sheriff Hawkins called out, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol, "I need to talk to you about some federal warrants that just came through my office." "What kind of warrants?" Silas replied, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The kind that authorize me to arrest you and hold you for federal transport back to Washington. The kind that don't leave much room for discussion or negotiation." The moment of decision had arrived, and Elias found himself holding a partnership agreement worth a fortune in one hand and his Winchester rifle in the other, while two different versions of justice faced each other across a mountain clearing where the wrong word could start a shooting war. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a blade. 6 armed lawmen facing 4 security professionals, while 2 civilians tried to navigate the space between legal authority and personal loyalty. Sheriff Hawkins was a man perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face and careful eyes of someone who'd survived decades of frontier law enforcement by knowing when to push and when to negotiate. "Before anyone does something they'll regret," Elias said, stepping forward with his hands visible but his rifle still in reach. "Maybe we should hear what Sheriff Hawkins has to say." "Smart man," Hawkins replied, though his attention remained focused on Silas and Matthias. "Mr. Greer, I've got federal warrants here that require me to take you into custody. But I also know you're not the kind of man to run without good reason. The reason is that the federal investigation is a sham designed to cover up government incompetence," Silas said firmly. "Those people died because federal engineers built a defective dam, not because of anything my mining operations did." "That may be true," Hawkins acknowledged. "But my job isn't to determine guilt or innocence. It's to enforce the warrants I've been given. And these warrants are properly signed and sealed." Matthias shifted slightly, positioning himself to cover Silas if shooting started. "Sheriff, you know as well as I do that federal warrants aren't always based on factual evidence. Sometimes they're political tools used to pressure innocent people." "Sometimes they are," Hawkins agreed. "But sometimes innocent people get arrested, and the courts sort out the truth. That's how the system is supposed to work. The system assumes that the courts are interested in truth rather than political convenience," Silas replied. "When congressional committees have predetermined outcomes, the normal legal process becomes a form of persecution rather than justice." Elias found himself studying the faces of both groups, trying to read the intentions behind their careful words. Hawkins seemed genuinely reluctant to make the arrest, suggesting that he might be sympathetic to Silas's situation despite his legal obligations. But his deputies were tense and ready for violence, their hands never far from their weapons. "There might be a middle ground here," Elias said carefully. "Sheriff, what if Mr. Greer were willing to appear voluntarily before Judge Morrison to present his evidence? Wouldn't that satisfy the requirements of the federal warrants while ensuring that he gets a fair hearing?" Hawkins considered the suggestion, his eyes moving between Silas and the legal documents in his hand. "Judge Morrison doesn't have jurisdiction over federal warrants, but he might be willing to issue a temporary restraining order if there's evidence of procedural irregularities in the federal investigation." "There are significant irregularities," Silas said, pulling out his portfolio of documents, "starting with the fact that the Congressional Committee refused to examine engineering reports that prove the dam failure was caused by construction defects, not mining operations." "Show me," Hawkins said. For the next several minutes, Silas laid out the evidence he'd compiled: engineering reports, inspection records, photographs of the dam site, and correspondence between federal agencies that revealed significant disagreement about the cause of the failure. Even Elias, with his limited technical knowledge, could see that the documentation painted a very different picture than the one presented in the congressional accusations. "This is compelling evidence," Hawkins admitted after reviewing the materials. "But it doesn't change the fact that I have legal warrants requiring your arrest." "It changes the circumstances under which that arrest takes place," Matthias pointed out. "If you arrest Mr. Greer here, it looks like he was captured while fleeing from justice. If he surrenders voluntarily in town after presenting his evidence to Judge Morrison, it looks like a man confident in his innocence." The optics matter, Silas added, especially if this case is going to be decided in the court of public opinion as much as in federal court. Hawkins was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Federal warrants carried serious consequences for law enforcement officers who failed to execute them properly. But the evidence Silas had presented suggested that this particular case involved complexities that went beyond simple criminal prosecution. "Here's what I'm willing to do," he said finally. "Mr. Greer, you have until noon tomorrow to present your evidence to Judge Morrison and request a hearing on the validity of these federal warrants. If Judge Morrison agrees to review the case, I'll delay executing the arrest warrants until his decision. If he refuses to get involved, or if you fail to appear by noon tomorrow, I'll arrest you on the spot." "That's fair," Silas said immediately. "More than fair, considering the circumstances." But Hawkins continued, his tone carrying the weight of non-negotiable conditions. "You'll surrender all weapons and agree to remain in town under house arrest until Judge Morrison makes his decision. And you'll provide a substantial bond to ensure your appearance in court." "How substantial?" Matthias asked. $10,000. Cash or certified bank draft. The sum was enormous by frontier standards, but Elias could see from Silas's expression that it wasn't beyond his resources. The real question was whether Judge Morrison would be willing to challenge federal authority by reviewing evidence that contradicted a congressional investigation. "We have a deal," Silas said, extending his hand to Sheriff Hawkins. As the two men shook hands, Elias realized that the immediate crisis had been resolved through negotiation rather than violence. But the larger questions remained unanswered, and the partnership agreement in his pocket still represented a choice between security and opportunity that would define the rest of his life. "Mr. Thorne," Sheriff Hawkins said, turning his attention to Elias for the first time, "I understand you've been providing assistance to Mr. Greer. I hope you understand that harboring a fugitive from federal justice is a serious crime." "I understand that. Helping an injured man is the right thing to do," Elias replied steadily. "Whatever else Mr. Greer might be, he's also the man I pulled from under an overturned wagon and nursed back to health for 3 days." "Fair enough," Hawkins said. "But from this point forward, any assistance you provide makes you a co-conspirator in federal eyes. You might want to consider that before you make any further commitments." The warning was clear, and Elias felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy pack. Tomorrow would bring Judge Morrison's decision about the federal warrants, but tonight he had to decide whether to sign the partnership agreement that could make him wealthy or walk away from the opportunity and return to his simple mountain existence as Sheriff Hawkins, and his deputies prepared to escort Silas back to town. Elias caught the older man's eye and saw something there that looked like hope mixed with resignation, the expression of a man who'd done everything he could to secure justice and was now waiting to see whether the system would reward his faith or destroy him for challenging its authority. The ride into Greer's Crossing took place under an overcast sky that threatened snow, with Elias following the procession at a distance that allowed him to remain independent while still being close enough to witness whatever happened next. Shade ranged alongside his horse, yellow eyes alert to the tension that radiated from the group of armed men ahead. The town was larger than Elias had expected, with perhaps 300 residents and the kind of substantial buildings that suggested prosperity based on more than simple ranching or farming. The courthouse sat at the center of the main street, a 2-story brick structure that proclaimed the community's faith in law and order, while the surrounding businesses displayed the prosperity that came from being the commercial center for a wide rural area. Judge Morrison's office occupied the entire second floor of the courthouse, and by the time Elias reached the building, word had already spread that Silas Greer was in town under federal arrest warrants. A crowd had gathered in the street, their voices carrying the mix of curiosity and concern that accompanied any significant legal drama in a small community. "He's been good to this town," Elias heard one woman say to her companion. Built the school, funded the church, always fair in his business dealings. Federal marshals don't come all this way for nothing, another voice replied. Must be something serious to bring Washington into our affairs. Elias tied his horse to the hitching rail and made his way through the crowd toward the courthouse steps. As he climbed toward the second floor, he could hear voices from Judge Morrison's chambers, Silas presenting his evidence, Sheriff Hawkins explaining the circumstances of the federal warrants, and a third voice that carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to weighing complex legal questions. The corridor outside the judge's chambers was lined with chairs, where people waited for hearings and appointments. But today it was empty except for Matthias, who stood guard with the alert patience of a professional soldier. He nodded as Elias approached but said nothing, both men understanding that the next hour would determine whether their employer faced federal prosecution or gained the breathing room needed to fight the charges. Through the partially open door, Elias could hear Judge Morrison asking detailed questions about the engineering reports Silas had brought. The judge's voice carried no hint of his opinion, but the fact that he was asking technical questions rather than simply deferring to federal authority suggested that he was taking the evidence seriously. The Congressional Committee claims that your mining operations destabilized the geological structure supporting the dam, Judge Morrison was saying. How do you respond to that accusation? Your Honor, our mining operations were conducted more than 5 miles downstream from the dam site, Silas replied. The geological surveys clearly show that the two areas are separated by completely different rock formations. There's no way our activities could have affected the dam's structural integrity, and yet the Congressional Committee has testimony from federal engineers stating the opposite. Yes, Your Honor, from engineers who work for the same Territorial Development Authority that built the defective dam. They have a clear interest in shifting blame away from their own construction failures, Sheriff Hawkins spoke up. Your Honor, I've reviewed Mr. Greer's evidence, and it appears to contradict significant portions of the federal investigation. Whether or not he's ultimately guilty of the charges, there seem to be substantial questions about the reliability of the Congressional Committee's conclusions. The question before me, Judge Morrison said, is whether I have authority to issue a restraining order that would prevent execution of federal arrest warrants. That's not a decision I can make lightly, Your Honor, Silas said. I'm not asking you to obstruct federal justice. I'm asking you to ensure that federal justice is based on facts rather than political convenience. If I am arrested and transported to Washington before these engineering reports can be properly examined, the truth may never come to light. There was a long silence from the judge's chambers, broken only by the sound of papers being shuffled and what might have been a law book being opened and consulted. Elias found himself holding his breath, aware that the next few words would determine whether Silas Greer remained free to fight the charges or disappeared into the federal legal system where political pressure often mattered more than evidence. Mr. Greer, Judge Morrison said finally, I'm going to issue a temporary restraining order preventing your arrest for 72 hours. That will give you time to arrange for proper legal representation and ensure that your evidence is submitted to the appropriate federal authorities through proper channels. The relief in Silas's voice was evident even through the closed door. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, the judge continued. This restraining order is temporary and limited. If federal authorities choose to challenge it, I may not be able to maintain it against their opposition. And if you use this time to flee the jurisdiction, I'll personally sign the warrant for your arrest. Understood. Your Honor, I have no intention of running from these charges. See that you don't. Sheriff Hawkins, I'm releasing Mr. Greer into your custody pending resolution of the federal charges. He's to remain in town and report to your office twice daily until this matter is resolved. As the hearing concluded and the participants began filing out of the judge's chambers, Elias felt the partnership agreement in his pocket like a physical weight. Judge Morrison's decision had given Silas 3 days of freedom. but it hadn't resolved the fundamental questions about his guilt or innocence. The time had come for Elias to make his own decision about whether to trust a man he'd known for 4 days with his future, his security and possibly his freedom. Standing in the courthouse corridor, surrounded by the trappings of law and order, Elias realized that some decisions couldn't be made through careful analysis of evidence and legal precedent. Sometimes a man had to trust his instincts about another man's character and accept the consequences of that trust, whatever they might be. He pulled the partnership agreement from his pocket and looked for a pen. 6 months later, Elias stood on the covered porch of his expanded cabin, watching the morning light paint the peaks above Widow's Notch in shades of gold and amber. The structure had grown considerably since the autumn day when he'd first heard the crash that changed his life. A proper dining room, a guest bedroom, and a study where he could review mining reports and correspondence that arrived weekly from investors across 3 territories. Shade emerged from beneath the porch where he'd spent the night, though these days he often had to compete for space with the 3 additional dogs that had joined their mountain household. The pack ranged from a rescued pointer to a massive shepherd that Silas had given him as a Christmas gift, all of them now integrated into the security routine that protected the most profitable mining operation in the territorial system. The partnership had proven even more valuable than Silas's. Conservative estimates had suggested the copper deposits beneath Elias's homestead were among the richest ever discovered in the region, while careful mining practices had minimized environmental damage and maintained good relations with local communities. More importantly, their operation had become a model for how extraction industries could work with, rather than against, the people who lived on the land. Judge Morrison's temporary restraining order had provided just enough time for Silas's lawyers to present their evidence to a federal grand jury that proved more interested in facts than political convenience. The Congressional Committee's accusations had collapsed under scrutiny, leading to a broader investigation of the Territorial Development Authority that ultimately resulted in criminal charges against the engineers responsible for the defective dam. The Paiute families who had died in the flood were properly memorialized, with a monument funded by Silas's mining company, while their surviving relatives received compensation that acknowledged the government's responsibility for the tragedy. It wasn't justice in the sense of bringing back the dead, but it was recognition that their deaths hadn't been forgotten or dismissed as acceptable. Casualties of territorial development. Marshall Davidson had been reassigned to a desk job in Washington after the investigation revealed his role in suppressing evidence that contradicted the Congressional Committee's predetermined conclusions. Sheriff Hawkins had been elected to a 2nd term with the largest margin in county history, his handling of the Greer case having earned him a reputation for fairness and integrity that transcended political affiliations. But it was the letter that arrived with the morning mail that brought the biggest smile to Elias's face, written in the careful script of someone who'd learned to read and write late in life. It came from a young Paiute woman named Sarah Crowfeather, who'd been accepted to the Territorial Teachers College with a scholarship funded by the Elias Thorne Mining Partnership. "Dear Mr. Thorne," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that I received my teaching certificate last week and will be starting at the new school in Pine Ridge this fall. Thanks to your partnership's education fund, I'll be the first member of my family to work as a professional teacher, and I plan to honor the memory of those we lost by ensuring that their stories are told accurately to future generations." The education fund had been Elias's idea, a way to ensure that the wealth generated by their mining operation created opportunities for the communities most affected by territorial development. Silas had embraced the concept enthusiastically, recognizing that sustainable business practices required investment in human capital as much as mineral extraction. Their partnership had evolved beyond simple business arrangement into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Silas spent several months each year at the mountain operation, living in the guest bedroom and helping with the practical challenges of running a complex enterprise in remote wilderness. His knowledge of finance and law complemented Elias's understanding of the land and its people, creating a collaboration that had attracted attention from investors and government officials throughout the Western Territories. The sound of horses approaching from the valley trail interrupted his morning reflections. Through the trees, Elias could see a familiar figure riding up the mountain, Silas Greer, returning from a month-long business trip to San Francisco, where he'd been negotiating contracts with shipping companies that would transport their copper ore to markets as far away as New York and Boston. "Morning, partner," Silas called out as he reached the cabin, his greeting carrying the warmth of genuine friendship rather than mere business courtesy. "Morning," Elias replied, walking down to help with the horses. "How did the negotiations go?" "Better than expected. We've got contracts that will keep the operation profitable for at least the next 5 years, with options for extension if the mineral deposits prove as extensive as our geologists believe." They spent the next hour reviewing the details of the new contracts, their conversation mixing business planning with the comfortable exchanges of men who'd learned to trust each other's judgment completely. The wealth that their partnership had generated was significant, but the friendship they'd built was worth even more to both of them. As the morning progressed and they settled into the routine of planning the day's activities, Elias reflected on the choices that had brought him to this point. The decision to save an injured stranger had led to opportunities he could never have imagined, but more importantly, it had connected him to a wider community of people working to build something better than the often harsh realities of territorial life. The mountains were still his sanctuary, but they were no longer his isolation. The cabin was still his home, but it was now part of a larger network of relationships and responsibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of his original homestead claim. Standing on his porch in the morning light, watching Shade play with the younger dogs, while Silas reviewed mining reports at the kitchen table, Elias understood that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency really do carry the greatest consequences. Not because they're calculated to produce specific results, but because they open possibilities that couldn't have existed without the willingness to help a stranger when help was needed. The echo of that crashed wagon had indeed reverberated through his entire life, but the sound it made was one of opportunity, friendship, and the kind of success that comes from treating other people as if their welfare matters as much as your own. In the distance, the peaks of the high country caught the morning sun and held it like a promise that some things, friendship, integrity, the willingness to do right by others, were worth more than all the copper and silver buried beneath the mountain stone.